All right, I think we are live. Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everyone. I'm here with Dr. Ashley Frawley, who looks at culture and culture studies. She's originally from Canada and is a member of the Nipissing First Nation. I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly. She lectures on social problems, on economics of social policy, parenting culture, and the sociology of health and illness. Obviously, I'm reading off of what I, advertised earlier. But the reason why we have her here today is, in my opinion, she's not only an academic, but an outspoken voice on social media, especially on Twitter, etc. And she has a very different take on what the left is today and where it needs to proceed to. So what I would like to do today is, Dr. Frawley, is first try and introduce you to a Pakistani audience. Secondly, converse with you about what I have titled as the dematerialization of the left, its movement away from economic analysis, its movement away from structural analysis, and what you call its tendency now to look at, in fact, what you call making a mess out of cultural studies and making a mess out of analysis of culture. How did that happen? What is that? And why is that problematic? So before we get into that, I think what I'd like to do before we get into the nitty-gritty of what the left is today and what it ought to be, I would like to maybe if you could briefly introduce yourself, where you come from. I've given a brief overview, but I think it would be of interest to our audiences to know your own sort of life journey and how you ended up being an academic.
Sure. So that was a really good introduction, actually. It covered everything. So yeah, I'm from Canada. I currently lecture in Wales at Swansea University. I did my undergraduate degree in Canada at Wilfrid Laurier University, which some people may recognize as the center of the Lindsay Shepherd controversy. Was it years ago? Feels like a million years ago. Yeah, I can completely understand, how that happened. I did my degree, my first degree in anthropology and sociology. I double majored, and yeah, I definitely finished that degree really, really woke. And of course, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of good stuff in like absolutely anthropology is to understand that there are different ways of doing things all around the world, really problematizes the idea of, when people will say, well, this is just the way things are, it's just human nature. Well, obviously, an undergraduate degree in anthropology will question that, because almost anything that you could think of as being normal, natural, inevitable is different in different places. So that's what I sort of take from that. So, that's where I did my undergraduate degree, and then I moved to Greece for a little while. And I taught English, and then I came to do postgraduate research at the University of Kent in England, and been here in the UK ever since that time. But great. I think my sort of, yeah.
No, there's two aspects of your journey here that are, I think, of particular interest perhaps to people on the left, which is firstly that you come from a working class background, you put yourself through college, encountered enormous debt, etc. And secondly, that you are part Native American as well, and that you're familiar with that culture. I thought those are two very interesting aspects of your life. So now let's move, given that I've given that introduction, now let's move to some very interesting ideas. So you're not a woke leftist, it seems. You're anti-woke, it seems. Am I right to characterize you in that particular way?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are certain forms of wokeness, I guess, or like cultural criticism that I think are kind of dangerous and dangerously mimic race realism and trends in the culture that have not led us good places in the past. And I think that kind of quote unquote leftism that's obsessed with language, that thinks that everything is downstream from culture, I think it's really become a cancer on the left, and it's infected the way that people think of the left now. They think, oh, leftists, so everybody's gone too far left, they're all Marxists. And I was like, I wish, I wish everybody was a Marxist, and they would understand the error of their ways. They would understand that what they're doing would if they actually read some of Marx's work, they would be pretty embarrassed of themselves, I think. And I think actually a lot of what passes for the left today actually sits more easily along what would have been the right wing of the French Revolution, the romantic reaction to the French Revolution. That's kind of where we get the origin of left and right, as I'm sure your listeners know. But if you go back historically and think about what the left was about and what the right was about, you can see that what passes for the left today is almost like a reversal. The left side of the political spectrum included, liberalism, but also socialism and communism, obviously. But it's not that they wanted to like throw the whole thing out, throw out all bourgeois society and so on. At least socialism and communism that were influenced by Marx were about taking those ideals, taking the ideals of the French Revolution to their logical conclusion. C.L.R. James has a great line, I believe it's C.L.R. James, where he said, the French Revolution started in France but finished in Haiti. So if you really took those ideals to their logical conclusions, you would see that you would actually have to overthrow bourgeois society itself, that it's not possible to have freedom, brotherhood, equality, and so on within the confines of capitalism. And so we had to take the system further to really create the freedoms that it promised. And I think that's what I take from Marx. And I think that unfortunately, through a long it's kind of a long story how we got here, but the 20th century basically left a bad taste in our mouth when it comes to the ideals of liberalism. And those ideals have come to be blamed, the idea of humans triumphing over nature, the man of absolute self-creation, all of these things were blamed for the Holocaust and so on. But I think that actually these things were an extreme. I think the worst atrocities of the 20th century were an extreme reaction to the inability of equality and so on to truly exist in the world. So, for example, race realism, as Kenan Malik argues in his really, really good book, The Meaning of Race, I highly recommend people read it. But he makes the argument there that, when the ideals of the French Revolution were questioned, when people looked out into the world and they said, I don't see equality, I don't see brotherhood, I see war, I see inequality, I don't see rationality, I see irrationality. And so they started to question this, and they had to ask, why did these things fail to come to fruition? And for some people, on the sort of romantic reaction to the Enlightenment, for some the answer was difference, human difference. Well, human beings are just different. We could never have this world because people have different cultures and different aptitudes and so on. And that was the sort of the soft cultural side to it. But there was also a darker side, which was race realism. And eugenics. Well, why can't we reach this utopia? Well, because they're degenerate people. And through sort of through this pathology located within them and their body and their race and so on, that's why we have these people, they're holding society back and so on. But that was a reaction to the failure of liberal ideals, not an extreme, not taking them to their, well, to a certain extent it was taking them to their logical conclusions. But I don't think it was, I think you have to understand the way that it was also a reaction to those things not being able to be lived out within the capitalist system.
So what you're saying is that the failure of liberalism, the failure to realize the French Revolution, and the sort of horrible things that came with modernity were sort of grouped together with a Marxist analysis. And it was sort of, for example, in your article, you write about the disillusionment with big ideas. You write about how Marxism amongst a certain group of people was considered to be a totalizing narrative that would lead to totalitarianism. Sociological determinism would lead to totalitarianism.
Well, it's understandable because it did lead to that. It did lead to that, right? But the answer was to throw the whole thing out. Again, it's understandable, but I think that a deeper sort of economic analysis will lead us to the same questions again. And we have to ask ourselves, why did our attempts to change society fundamentally so radically fail? Because it's not like, oh, it would be great, let's have a revolution, things would be so much better. And people are like, well, that didn't happen. You know, I understand that, right? But it's that capitalism isn't just, it's not like it's just going to go on and on and on forever and everything's fine. It is producing more and more destructive crises that are throwing up these questions again. And we do need big totalizing ideas. And unfortunately, the lesson that we took from the 20th century was that those ideas are dead. Those ideas lead us in bad places. Let's just have, you know, our little pockets of freedom and cracks of freedom and you know, spontaneous this and that. I think we need more systemic thinking.
Right. What's the role of the Frankfurt School in the dematerialization of the left? How did, you know, how did we move from examining the political economy of capitalism, looking at its economic laws, looking at the theory of surplus value, the falling rate of profit, the kind of classes that it created, the dynamics between classes, et cetera, to this new sort of woke cultural criticism? You mentioned in one of your articles that it's the Frankfurt School that led to the suppression of economics in favor of cultural criticism. Do you think we went wrong somewhere over there? Is the Frankfurt School really to blame for this transition, or one of the things that's to blame for this transition?
No, I wouldn't put the blame on them. I think in that article I say that it's that turn, that cultural turn, signifies some of what's happened. I think that the deeper sort of causes for this are, well, obviously with any massive cultural turn, there's going to be a huge range of causes. But I think one was the experience of the Second World War and this palpable exhaustion of political ideas and the questions that arose, you know, like, why wasn't there a revolution? Why didn't we overthrow capitalism? And the answer was culture, right? The sort of culture industries and so on. But at the same time, it wasn't just the Frankfurt School. I did this study, which I haven't published yet, but I've been doing this long-term kind of study of student newspapers from the early 20th century to the present. And it's very interesting. You see in the 1920s, it's all very frivolous and fun and so on. And then you get into the 1930s and it becomes the discourse becomes very political. And students really start to believe that they're going to change the world in fundamental ways. The world of tomorrow is going to be very different from the world today, and it's going to be better. And they're going to be responsible for the reasons that it's better. And they were arguing, there's all these like long form arguments between like Christian socialists and communists and the right wing and so on. And they're all arguing with each other. And they're saying, you know, we are going to be the leaders of tomorrow. And we are going to, and it mattered that they had these arguments. And then you have the Second World War and they, you know, the people left behind are just trying to like not get killed by bombs and so on. This is UK, by the way, that I'm looking at. Then you get to and the
destruction in Europe was even greater than the destruction of the United Kingdom.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. So you get to about 1948 and into as early as the 1950s. You can feel this palpable exhaustion, and you start getting these ideas of like the wisdom of the East and psychedelic drugs. And, you know, like doors of perception and all of that stuff starts to come in. And people just think, oh, and even Daniel Bell wrote, I believe in the 1950s, this is the end of history, like, or the end of ideology, that there's this palpable exhaustion as early as the mid 20th century. And so I think really the Frankfurt School is speaking to that. They're not causing that.
But I mean, just to play devil's advocate here, I mean, the destruction was mainly in Europe. Yet this new sort of trend that we're talking about with this recourse into psychological drugs or whatever you call it, you know, LSD and that sort of thing, and the Frankfurt School itself was principally based in the United States of America, where there was very little destruction, and in fact there was enormous prosperity coming about in the 1960s.
Yeah.
So,
and that's what I was about to say. That another cause is that there was enormous prosperity after the Second World War. And so when people ask the question, you know, they're looking back, taking stock of what had happened. Not only was there exhaustion with big ideas like, oh, look where this took us. Look, and, you know, you had Stalinism, and people started to get exhausted with the USSR and so on. They were also looking around them in the United States and seeing like, well, why did we fail? Look at this prosperity. And so prosperity, instead of being the answer, which was for earlier socialists, like if you look at Sylvia Pankhurst, who says, you know, we don't preach a gospel of want or whatever. We want more than all the people can consume, right? This idea for past socialists and communists was that increased consumption was going to give us the basis for a new kind of society freed from want and so on. Now the narrative shifts and it's people are being bought off. We're not having the revolution because things are too good. So prosperity becomes not the solution, but the problem. And you get this reverberating toward the present, this very like anti-consumerist kind of understanding, which I think is quite alien to early socialist and communist thought.
And is that what you call the romantic critique of capitalism? Is that what you're referring to as the romantic critique? Walk us through that. What is that exactly? What is the romantic critique of capitalism exactly?
Okay, so
aside from the broad outlines of where you're saying it's a rejection of consumerist culture and a rejection of increased prosperity. But aside from that, how is it sort of romantic? In what sense is it romantic?
So it's a rejection of the present, not on the basis of a hope for a future society, but based on the ideals of the past. So drawn from sometimes from Christendom, sometimes from ancient Greece, a real or imagined past, but always idealized, a time when things were better, when the degeneration that theorists see all around them didn't exist. So and
sometimes from the East as well, is it not? I mean, sometimes from Buddhism or Hinduism.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, big time. And that's always been a massive part of the Romantic reaction was, searching for some kind of antidote to the present by looking in other cultures for some sort of truer existence. So you had with indigenous people, you had the ideal of the noble savage, is just as racist as savage, like this, that you don't allow people to be fully multidimensional human beings, you just idealize them. And also the wisdom of the East and so on, just searching for some other ideas as an antidote to the present. And I contrast that kind of romanticism with, and now don't get me wrong, like romanticism has its place in a communist movement. Obviously, Marx used a lot of romanticism himself, but he says in the Grundrisse, it is as ridiculous to long for a return to that original fullness as it is to imagine with this complete emptiness all history has come to a standstill. So you can't, you can mourn what's been lost, but you can't go back to the past.
It's not possible.
Yeah, it's not possible to restore those values because the economic base that held them in position, that made them meaningful, is no longer there. And so you can mourn that destruction. That's part of the critique of what capitalism does, but you can't use it as a way as an escape valve for the present, as some people.
And do you think that the people who then hold on to these values, who consider themselves to be anti-capitalist, consider themselves to be anti-establishment, even anti-government, etc., anti-imperialist many times, pro-environment, pro-women's rights, and freedom for other races, etc. But they're looking not towards Marxism; they're looking towards the East, etc. So how does that connect to what your PhD thesis was also about? And I believe in 2015 you wrote you were published. Your book was published called The Semiotics of Happiness. So how does this romantic movement then connect to the idea that we should be, or does it connect to the idea that we shouldn't be sort of chasing after economic prosperity, but we should be looking at other things like happiness, and we're going to find these things in meditating or something of that sort? What's the dynamic there? Could you walk us through that?
Exactly that. So basically that, so what emerges out of this loss of the, I meant to say earlier that I counterpose the romantic critique to a more full sort of dialectical or materialist critique of capitalism, which is not just about negation and, destroying the present and going back, but about sublation, moving to a higher level. So understanding that there are contradictions and trying to figure out how do we bring that to a higher level. How do we take forward those aspects of capitalism that could potentially be creating a society, freed from want, freed from the coercive push to sell your labor to a capitalist and so on. You can see kind of little inklings of that within capitalism, but they're used against us and they destroy us. For example, the only thing worse The old joke is the only thing worse about within capitalism than being exploited is not being exploited. So like automation, which potentially frees human beings from toil and work and jobs that we don't want to do, becomes a way of throwing us out of the labor system or the labor market, and makes us destitute. This thing that creates immense abundance impoverishes us. That's perverse, right? But the question is, I can see it, the ability, the potential there. We just don't know how to get there. And the question is that we can only answer that through a materialist analysis. How do we get there to that world where want is, relegated to the dustbin of history? Think of the potential that might be there when you can work because you want to. You can create things because you want to, because you have a certain level, a certain basis of your material needs simply provided for you by automation, by the machines that dig up the raw materials and so on. And we're doing that within capitalism, except that it's used against us. Anyway, so that is a proper materialist analysis, which I counterpose to the more romantic one, which is unable to make sense of the economic trends that it sees. So for instance, you have this huge movement of like happiness economics or the New Economics Foundation, and they are seeing real trends. They are noticing that there is a problem within capitalism of slow and sluggish growth. But just like John Stuart Mill did in the past, what they do is they harmonize this. They see it because they see capitalism as just the natural state of the world. They think that it's this natural, harmonious, stationary state to which capitalism is progressing, and we have nothing to be afraid of. Let's just forget about economic growth, as though there was some puppet master pulling the strings. Like, should we have some economic growth? Sure. Most policies directly attempting to achieve economic growth are failures. It's not like people really kind of have a sense of what's going on or how to direct the economy, right? People are sort of floundering about. They have no idea. There was a very good tweet from Carl Shara recently where he said capitalism is like an old kitchen utensil or whatever machine that you've lost the instructions for, and you just like trying a bunch of different things. Will this work? Will this work? So it's a bit like that, so it's not like people know what's going on, but they see these trends and they try to harmonize it. So they start to talk about, well, maybe we don't need economic growth. Economic growth doesn't make us happy. We should find our happiness in the present, because society culturally has no future. And so the past was terrible. There is no future. The answer is to just maintain the present forever. So I call this a kind of presentist romanticism.
This is a very bleak analysis we're looking at, a bleak view of the world. There are lots of very interesting questions that are coming in from Sadia, Nazar, from Soban, and from Hassan Munir, and Shubhan as well. And we will definitely get to all your questions. Please keep writing in. Hasil, thank you. He's saying "Inko meri taraf se assalamu alaikum," which means.
Can I answer this question here? It says, "I don't see a problem necessarily with cultural or romantic critiques of capitalism. I think a direct line." I want you to come to that question, but what I want you to do before you come to that, I want you definitely to address that very question. But I was thinking before you get to answering those questions, and we'll have a whole sort of section to that. I wanted you to finish, your argument as you have presented it in your paper, which is so just one more section, and then we'll come to the questions, which is the aspect that we've seen, the psychological critique that we have seen. A lot of people are very interested in it. When I posted your sort of that we were going to do this talk, one of my friends, Hamza, wrote to me because he's very interested in these questions, and he was saying, how do we approach the question of psychological health? We have people like Elaine Botton, and we have people like Jordan Peterson, who have made a career out of telling people how to be happy, etc. And you've written a book which seems to me to be saying the exact opposite almost, which is that we can't be happy through this mechanism of psychology and individualized therapy, etc. So walk us through briefly about this explosion of pop psychology and wanting to make people happy through therapy. Is there something wrong with wanting to be happy, first of all? If not, then what is this phenomenon? What's actually going on over here? Why should we reject, therapy or this entire industry that's associated with it? Okay, so those are big questions. So where did this all come from? That's an enormous question that I go through in my book in detail. And basically, the way that I see it is that it's not like, what happens is when something makes the headlines in the newspapers, you tend to assume that it's done so because the problem got so pressing that it could no longer be ignored, right? There's so many people suddenly became very, very unhappy, and then professionals were like, oh, we should do something about this. No, that's not how it happened. So basically, what happened was they've been doing these happiness surveys since the late 1940s. And, you know, periodically they would be reported in the press and they say, well, people are just as happy as they've ever been since we started doing these surveys. Good job. And then something starts to change in the mid 1990s where people sort of take hold of this. And it becomes a mouthpiece for this kind of disenchantment or disillusionment with the present. And it becomes a critique of progress and a critique of growth. And it becomes a very presentist kind of discourse, way of saying, you know, look, we're just as happy as we've ever been, which on its own doesn't really say much. I mean, like, people tend to rate themselves about a 7 and on a 10-point scale of happiness, regardless of the time period. But the big moment was when they compared that to economic growth or to monetary indicators of various types. So they'll plot it on income. I say income has gone up, which by the way is questionable. Anyways, income has gone up a huge amount, and yet we are no happier. This is the line of happiness, and this is income. And GDP has increased by this much, and yet we are no happier. And everyone went, and that was the claim that got repeated all over the media. And people and the key thing is people organized around that idea and took hold of it and pushed it toward a political program. Because ideas don't just have a mind of their own, right? People hold these ideas, and for an idea to be successful, you need a certain amount of organization around it. But what's interesting about that is that nobody thought of things like, everyone just went, yeah, and they repeated it. That tells you there's something culturally that speaks to. And I go in the book, I say it reflects a kind of romantic anti-capitalism and a presentism and so on. And also, which I'll come to in a moment, subjectivity, this sense of diminished subjectivity. But nobody ever like compared, you know, women have way more freedom now than they did in 1950. And yet no happier. Go back to the kitchen, ladies. We've had a massive increase in the welfare state. The NHS was founded at the same time. And yet we are no happier. Bye-bye, NHS. Nobody makes that argument, right? But it was money. That was the thing that took off.
Right. So what explains this? I mean, what's the object here of the happiness movement? Is it we've got to move from 7 to 8 to 9 to 10, or was that the object? Or
no,
I'm still not following. Right.
So in terms of there were many people who took hold of this claim for a wide variety of reasons. So it's not the sort of, so there were some very big claims makers and groups that were very successful. So the New Economics Foundation, Richard Layard, who is a labor peer, he really organized around that, and he kind of connected with a few other very well-connected individuals, and they had these like this like mimicking grassroots kind of movement, action for happiness, you know, and they organized around that, but they were very well connected to policymakers. And so that idea was very smooth getting into policy because of that. But also there were, you know, positive psychologists, and there are a variety of things. So latching onto a new discourse gives you novelty. And obviously in academia, we need we need novelty. We need to be publishing in a new area. It was counterintuitive. So they would always say, for all these years, you know, psychologists have been focusing on what goes wrong. Let's focus on what goes right. And people would go, yeah, you know, that sounds great. And not thinking like, well, the reason why we focus on what goes wrong is because we assumed that without intervention, you know, if everything's okay, human beings can just get on with things. Now the claim is being made that they also need professional help in order to get on with things. And that was accepted. So this is why I say it also points to what I call diminished, not me, but many other sociologists call diminished subjectivity. So a sense that the subject, the human subject, is very weak by nature, very likely to become ill as a response to adversity, is very disoriented from the proper way of living life, and requires a range of professional interventions. And this explosion. medicine as well. But this explosion of happiness expertise goes hand in hand with this explosion of experts, all manner of experts in living. There is no aspect of life, it seems, too mundane for the intrusion of experts, who initially, what they do is they don't actually respond to a need. I've gone through this whole discourse, and the first claims were not coming from everyday people. They weren't like, tell me how to be happy out in the streets, like holding banners, like going on strike, employer, give me well-being, give me mindfulness. Like nobody was doing that, especially not in the 80s when this first happened. But where it came from, the very first claims were that happiness constitutes an expertise, something that requires specialized knowledge and intervention in order to achieve. That was the first claim. So first they, and Christopher Lasch talks about this as well, about the new experts. They play on, they sort of talk about the way that everyday people do things as silly and folk knowledge and old wives' tales and so on, and they posit their own knowledge as scientific, correct, and so on. And so they open up this space of doubt. I'm not doing this right. And like, for instance, one of the things was, you know, hard things take 10,000 hours of practice. How can we expect children to be happy if we don't teach it in schools? And that was an actual claim that was repeated again and again. It was just taken for granted that without professional intervention, people cannot live their lives, cannot be expected to live their lives.
So, you know, in a certain sense, I mean, this sounds a bit like Foucault, that they were turning society into a sort of mass patient, or that they could then analyze and, you know, sort of look at and dissect, etc.
It's exactly that. I think Foucault's analysis via Nicholas Rose, a very, very good book called Governing the Soul, which describes some of this. Doesn't look at happiness, but I draw quite a lot on Nicholas Rose as well.
Very interesting, because this is something which is, you know, totally out of my field, because I, you know, look at political economy, etc., and I've never really looked at the kind of literature that you're looking at. So this is very interesting.
Yeah, but I want your brain. I need political economy. I dabble a bit, but I'm very weak there.
Well, what we'll try and do is I'll try and pick on your brain, and I can give you whatever is available here, which is not a lot. But anyway, one sentence that I loved in your essay was when you wrote, "Now, not only do we have to be exploited, we have to enjoy it. We have to be happy about it."
Yeah.
Could you explain that? Because that sentence is stuck in my mind. And could you explain that just a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the way that power and authority works in contemporary society, it's not in that directly kind of coercive way. You know, if you have somebody like beating you on the head, at least your mind is still yours. You know, you can torture, but it's, you know, you can take a beating, but you can, you know, have the strength of will inside you. You're not going to give up the truth, you know, or whatever it is. But this kind of power is more insidious because it uses the language of opening up and removing stigma and well-being and happiness and so on. And a very good example of this is my sister, actually. I shouldn't say my sister. Whoops, I just outed who sent me this. Anyway, my sister sent me this picture from her office of they were given like these emojis that they are supposed to wear on their clothes that say like angry, disappointed, happy, and you're supposed to wear it on your clothes when you're walking around the office. What an incredible intrusion. If I fucking hate, excuse me, sorry, if I hate my job, I don't want anybody to know it. Let me just go in, day out, do my thing. As long as I do my job, what is it your business whether or not I like it? But now I gotta wear this emoji and say I'm angry. And do you want to talk about that? And it's funny because she was telling me that like the management loved it. And they were all talking about how it's opening things up and it's removing the stigma and so on. And all of the workers were like, what is this? And they just felt really weird. Yeah, they felt that it was an intrusion. And you can see this in China. There's a very good sociologist who looks at these trends in China called Yang Ji. And she looks at the way that it's very explicitly, therapeutic discourses are very explicitly used to divide workers. So they, you know, you have the neoliberal turn within China and they've shut down these factories and there's anger, right? And they were promised a livelihood and they don't get it. And that could be a revolutionary kind of anger if it's social, right? They can come together, take over the factory, they can strike, they can make things very difficult for those in power. And what happens is they use therapeutic discourses in a very explicit way to kind of like medicalize that, say, oh yes, this is depression. You have this thing called depression, and they'll even retrain people who've lost their jobs as like therapist taxi drivers, therapist housemaids, and like it's not only does therapy become this way of dividing people and individualizing their discontent, but it also becomes a way of sopping up excess labor, which I think is the political economy side of this is very interesting as well, because I've seen this in Wales where they have this like well-being, all this well-being stuff, and they will explicitly say this will provide jobs for people that have lost their jobs because of deindustrialization. So they create this need in society that these new experts then go to fill.
Interesting.
And so I think it actually came from everyday people. You mentioned one of the last bits of your question was like, oh, is it wrong to search for happiness? I don't care. Like we all kind of do that anyway. We're all just trying to like do the best we can for our families and our lives and ourselves. It's when this becomes an expert discourse, a political program, that's what I'm interested in. How does that work? Where does it come from? How does it manufacture consent? That's Chomsky. But how does it manufacture our willingness to go along with things?
Interesting. So now let's try and sort of sum up all of the thoughts that we've sort of discussed, because they were quite amazing, and we discussed quite a number of things. So the new left that we see very prevalent on Twitter, we see it very prevalent globally on social media, etc. If I take a phrase where you've sort of quoted Marx, you say it's a kind of criticism which knows how to judge and condemn the present, but not how to comprehend it. You might not.
No, I was just mouthing it. One of my favorite quotes is the kind of knows that it condemn the present, but not how to comprehend it.
So you feel this quotation describes what's going on with the left today because of its tendency towards a romantic critique, its tendency to glorify, romanticize the past and the East, and its tendency to sort of get bogged down in the psychological and cultural critique without looking at structure, without looking at political economy. So have I correctly summed up your sort of criticism of the woke left today? Is that what you feel?
Yeah, I mean, it operates on various levels across the left. Even people who are anti-woke will sometimes espouse these kinds of ideas. But I don't think that sums up my argument. But I think that what I'm saying about why it's not good to have this sort of diminished subjectivity, why it's not good to have this kind of anti-consumerism, is that it winds up as a dangerous mirror image of the dominant ideology that it claims to be against. Right. So like take anti-consumerism. I don't know about you, but I don't typically go on strike asking my employer to pay me less. What do I go on strike for? I want more. I want more of the social value that I create. Every single product in this world is created by human hands. We don't find our happiness. We don't, as human beings, we work on the world. We make things, right? Marx wasn't criticizing objectification as such. It was objectification within capitalism, which is alienated from us. And it's not that we're supposed to then, oh, I don't want products. I'm not going to find my happiness in things. I'm going to like meditate and find my happiness inside me. No, absolutely not. The point is to take that creativity and bring it back together with human beings, instead of it being an alienating force, something that acts back upon us. It should be something that expresses our humanity. As human beings, we work on the world, and in so doing, we work on ourselves, we change ourselves. And I don't mean that in like a new age kind of sense. I mean that we literally change what it means to be human by working on the world. That is our creativity. To say that we should just find happiness without stuff, first of all, makes it very hard to argue for better wages. For why? Because we want money. Like we want to be able to live. We want security and we want freedom. And one day we're going to have all of it, not just the piece of it that we get when we beg our bosses. We want all of it. And when we talk about wanting less, being happy with less, we undercut what is that fundamental task.
So would you also say then that this seems to be the leftism of a class of people who already has enough? Because if you don't have enough, when I look at working people in my country, in Pakistan, I mean, it's true that religion is used as to pacify people and to say, well, everything will be okay in the afterlife, whatever difficulties you have in this life. But I think the desire to have a better living in this life is very strong amongst working people in this country. Whereas in the intelligentsia, there is this anti-consumer sort of trend. But in the working class, I see zero anti-consumerist politics whatsoever. Is that the case also in the West?
Yeah, I mean, like, Zizek has a great line where he says, "Who is it that loves gold-plated stuff? It's working class people." Like, rich people can buy things just because of the quality. You know, I don't like the labels all over everything. It's too ostentatious. I buy this because it's good, it's well made, it'll last. Whereas I know, like, as soon as I got some money, I was like, Gucci. No, I'm kidding.
Let's get the brand.
I've never owned anything Gucci in my life.
No, but you wanted to get the good stuff.
But I wanted something good, and it's not because, and like, obviously, I don't want to fetishize Gucci or whatever. But I'm saying what it's symbolic of is this desire for a better life, and I think that it's wrong to sneer at working class people for wanting something better, and I think that has really led the left astray. And I mean, like, the mainstream left, political parties and so on have been sneering at working people for such a long time. You know, anything to do with materialism, anything to do with like jobs has been totally bequeathed to the right. But what do you want in your life? You want the freedom that comes with a certain amount of security. And where do we get that with capitalism? At least, you know, the security of a job, if we can get it, right? And to say that we shouldn't want that we should find our happiness within, ignores what are people's aspirations. And I think there's a very good essay by Oscar Wilde. It's one of my favorite essays, The Soul of Man Under Socialism. And he says, you know, a lot of times the poor are, he doesn't say the word fetishized, but, you know, poor are fetishized, and it's, you know, we're like, oh, you know, they're poor but happy, that's so great. And he says, no, the best among them are unhappy. The best among them refuse to accept their lot in life.
Nice.
And I think that's absolutely right. I think that there's this that discontent with the way that things are is a powerful force, and I don't think it should be medicalized. I don't think that it should be looked down upon.
Right, very nice. I was quite shocked when I read in your essay that some of the left, you know, sort of looks at working people as the problem rather than as the solution to the problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
What is that all about? I mean, that sounds insanely unleftist and completely right-wing to me.
Yeah, well, you'd think so. But I think for a long time, there has been this shift toward thinking of people. We have this sort of comfort, at least sort of middle class sort of intellectuals and professionals and so on, who exist in this sort of social problem industry. You know, their bread and butter is attending to the problems of the working class. And I see this kind of with dissertations. You know, every year I mark a ton of dissertations. And you know, how many dissertations are about discovering this problem, and they don't realize they're talking about poor people, but they are, of like parents, right? The parents are doing X and they're doing all these things wrong. We're going to go in and we're going to fix their parenting, and then we're not going to have any social problems anymore. People have lost so much this structural analysis of society that they're convinced themselves that it's something within you. You're the problem. Your behavior is the problem. The way you feel
as an individual.
Children. Exactly, is the problem. And I'm going to go in, I'm going to fix you. I'm going to give you the right parenting methods. I'm going to give you the right feelings, the right behaviors. And then, of course, it doesn't work because the inequality in society, social problems are not a result of people's parenting methods and so on. But because there's no structural analysis, people just get more and more frustrated. You know, for years we've been telling you, stop smoking, and yet you keep smoking. You must be stupid. And we get people becoming more and more misanthropic. You know, people are stupid; they can't be reasoned with, and so policy becomes more and more heavy-handed. It becomes less and less about trying to convince people of a particular course of action, and it becomes more coercive because they're just so convinced that it can't possibly be their models that are wrong. It's got to be you. You know, it's got to be something within you.
Wow. All right. I think phenomenal discussion. I wanted to go on, but also there's a lot of comments coming in, and I know you wanted to answer one. Do you want me to read them out to you, or I can quickly read out a few?
Yeah, that jumped out at you that you thought were interesting. There was just one where someone said, I'd love to answer if I could. I don't see a problem necessarily with cultural or romantic critiques of capitalism. I think a direct line can be drawn from anti-consumerism to more socialist arguments. I don't think so. Okay, to a certain extent, maybe, yes, I do recognize that, you know, we have these enormous, massive forces of production that could be used to end want, to give everybody a fantastic standard of living. And we're using them to like churn out little rubber ducks. Like, I understand that, right? I'm not saying like everything that's created in capitalism is wonderful, but I think that the critique of consumerism masks a critique of the working class. That the reason why we don't have a revolt is because the working class has it too good. Oh, that's where you go wrong. And I think that is where it becomes very alienating, where people want to have socialism because they want to make people nicer, they want to make people better. And people reject that. Don't tell me how I want to live. Don't tell me I got to be a philosopher or something like that. Like, not everybody needs to be like a philosopher or whatever. Like, the point of socialism,
and not everybody has to be in the
better.
same mold, right? So not everybody has to be cut out in the same mold, be happy, be this, be that, etc.
I want socialism because I want it to free us to be whatever you want to be. You want to sit on your ass, sit on your ass. You want to be a painter, be a painter. A fisherman, be a fisherman. So that, there's a line in the German ideology where it says that in advanced communism, it'll free us to be a philosopher in the evening, a fisherman in the morning, a hunter, without having to be a fisherman, a philosopher, or a hunter. And when we have that base of freedom, then you can do whatever you want to do. Like, think about what your life would be like if everything you needed was just provided through automation. You could be like, Comrade Alexa, I need a new shirt, and like the automated production, which is, they're already creating like shirts. Like, it used to be that you had to have human beings that would sew the shirts. They're finding ways to even push human beings out of the process there. But think about, if that was for the purposes of human freedom, what would you do with your life? Would it be the same as it is now? Heck no. Like, what would I do? I would be on like a committee trying to figure out how to terraform Mars. I think that's what I would do. It's like an early love of space and a frustration with how much energy, human energy and insight and just the human potential is wasted reproducing our existence, having to go and work for a capitalist for a certain part of the day, a certain part of the day to reproduce your own wages, and then a certain part of the day to enrich somebody else. So Paris Hilton can go on a yacht and have the freedom that you deserve. That's what I want. I want socialism and communism because I want it to free human beings, because I trust that human beings can handle that freedom. They don't need to be brought to a perfect point of subjectivity in order to do it. I think that we can. I think that human beings can deal with freedom. We have dealt with freedom. Like, capitalism does give us much more freedom than was the case in the past, where, obviously, it's constrained, but we're not born a peasant to die a peasant. We can sell our labor to whatever capitalist we want. It is a certain step up, right? So that's, I think that kind of freedom-loving communism is lost. And I think we need to read a little bit of Oscar Wilde to get it back. That kind of like, nothing's too good for the working class. That's not Oscar Wilde, but these older socialists that believed that abundance held the key to the future. And I think that is where we need to go. And obviously, I don't want to fetishize abundance. What I'm saying is we have the ability now, materially, to make a better life for everybody. How can we turn it around for the good of human beings? That's the question that I want to ask. And I think the second part of that was just what it doesn't lead us down that road, because it can undermine those things and say that you should really find happiness within yourself, and that the whole thing is kind of this like project to reform people's subjectivity, which I think excites very few people.
Nearly a third of the people of Pakistan are under the poverty line. For me, personally, socialism means that there wouldn't be any poverty in this country, And getting into the nitty-gritty of reforming individual minds, etc., sounds absolutely absurd to me when we've got such a massive problem of poverty in the country. If your socialism is not about the working class, then whatever your socialism is an unrecognizable socialism to me, frankly. So let's just read through quickly some of the comments. Rifat Andrabi says, hello. Zainul Abidin, good comrade of mine, has several comments. Sadia Nazir has made several comments. I'll read through some of them. Qasim gives you a thumb up. Then Azaz Khan says, I have no idea what he's saying. He's talking some language that I can't understand. Sadia, absolutely right. Sadia says, capitalism is a problem, but communism too failed in the West. What would you say about that? I'm just going to read through all the comments, and then you can look at also whichever one you like. Was Osho also part of this romantic reaction to capitalism as well as socialism? Subhan asks.
What was that? I missed the beginning of that question.
Osho. O-S-H-O. I don't know what that means. What is Osho?
Oh, okay. I'm not sure. I should know, probably. I don't.
Subhan, if you're listening still, please explain to us what you mean by Osho, because I didn't get it either. Subhan said he doesn't see a problem with romantic critiques of capitalism, but you addressed that. Then we have nothing. I just want to say, live healthy, stay healthy. Yes, but we've already established that that's not possible without getting rid of capitalism. And efforts to do that within capitalism are leading to this sort of weird sort of place, which is
can I say also about romanticism? Like, I do want to say that romantic critique has its place. The problem is when that's all we have. When romanticism is all we have.
Right.
You know, that longing for the past, you know, there's something in that. You know, I'm Ojibwe and I feel it. I feel the culture when culture is lost. I feel lost. I understand that, but you can't go back. And we may be able to bring something forward from that past. Absolutely. Primitive communism. You know, Marx talks quite a lot about primitive communism, but you can't have primitive communism. That ship has sailed.
No, I get it. Yeah, it can't be exclusively that. You have to look at the structure, you have to look at class, you have to look at relations of exploitation. I get it. Hasil Qureshi says, hello, Hurmat Ali Shah, thank you, Nasir Mustafa and Sahar Rahat and Sadia. And Naeem Malik asks, the democratic system is the best, can be retrofit to meet the need of society culture. Sure, I think we want democracy, but we've got to see how capitalism and democracy will contradict, right? Imran Khatak says, how can we be happy if we have no economic growth? Die in present with hunger. This ain't right. Culture, not logic.
Here's the thing, actually, that is another dangerous thing about happiness discourses. People actually are not that unhappy in horrible circumstances. Now, that is not for 1 second any reason to keep people in those circumstances. That is a testament to the human spirit. And you can see that people are actually saying, like, there was actually a very good paper, terrible paper by a positive psychologist where he actually went to India and studied street sleepers and prostitutes. And he was like, yeah, they're unhappy, but they're not as unhappy as we might expect. And then his conclusion is, why do we have this stereotype of poor people as being unhappy? And then I'm sure he got back onto his plane and flew back to his comfortable life. You know, that's it. That's the human spirit that makes the best of a bad situation, and it can be used to keep us in this situation forever.
Yeah, I'm reminded of Rousseau's quote where he says, you know, there's I forget what he says. He says there's peace even in the dungeon, but you know, what we're really looking for is freedom. You know, so freedom from want is very, very important. Even though people who live in abject poverty may find ways to keep themselves happy and are happy. You know, they listen to music. You know, I've seen this often, that we, in many ways, they are sometimes actually freer than middle class people who have all these other sort of social pressures on them, and you know, they're like, screw all that, and, you know. Anyway, Ali Abbas sends you his love. And is there any role of mysticism, Akib Khan asks, to keep happy and calm yourself, and what it affects on our psychology? I assume that's what he's trying to say. Is there any role of mysticism, in your opinion?
So one of the things that I've been looking at recently is the popularization of mindfulness in the West. And like, okay, so for individuals, you know, whatever floats your boat, you want to meditate, cool. Like, whatever, you know, like I also have a whole bunch of like degenerate things in my head too. Like, I would never. I don't mean to call meditation degenerate. I just mean like apolitical things that we do. You know, I would never elevate my marriage to a political program. My personal life is personal, right? But when these things get elevated to a political program, they signify that something is happening in the culture, that we are seeing a sort of depoliticization and a personalization of social problems. And that's what mindfulness discourse does, at least in the West. It basically says, like, it's an interesting discourse because happiness and self-esteem were also very big therapeutic discourses that were very popular. But they actually promised to solve problems. So the happiness discourse, they like big claims were made. Like maybe if we had, so in 2009, maybe if we had just focused on the true meaning of happiness, then we wouldn't have had too much people taking loans they couldn't afford. just ridiculous stuff like that. But in the mindfulness discourse, they don't actually make promises to solve problems, which I think is interesting. So there's a kind of cultural pessimism that comes to the fore in that discourse that doesn't necessarily exist. It exists in the earlier ones, but it's much more pronounced, where it basically says, look, okay, we're not going to solve problems. Like, obviously there are certain claims makers who do say, like, this is going to solve everything. John Kabat-Zinn is like, all these, like, policymakers should teach mindfulness because we're getting at social problems at the very core. The mind, the human mind. The human mind is the core of all social problems, he basically says. But others will say things like, it doesn't solve problems, it just helps you to deal with the cacophony, with the complexity. And they construct your individual subjectivity is just like totally chaotic, and the world is totally chaotic, and nothing is within your control. Nothing, not even your own mind. And it offers you this ability to retreat so you can just cope. And I find that very interesting. And so elevated to a political program, I think that signifies for me that we are losing even more, at least the people who sort of latch onto this discourse and think, yeah, this is the answer, have more or less kind of given up on this idea that human rationality provides the key. No, human rationality is the problem. We are irrational. We are unable to control the world. We are, never mind the world. Like, Karl Marx was like, all we need to do is we need to understand the mechanisms of the economy, and then we will make history in the full light of reason. Who believes that today? Now it's like, all we have to do is understand the mechanisms of the human mind, and we can sleep better. And we'll be able to just get on with things. It's like, we're never going to change the world.
It sounds to me like a new form of an opiate. I mean, it sounds to me like religion got a bit outdated. And this, happiness, psychology, this romanticism is brought in as a new form of religion, as a new form of an opiate, rather than
it absolutely is. Absolutely, and it tells a very specific story about why things are the way they are, because of human beings. So again, the same thing I mentioned before with race, where people looked out at the world and they saw this mismatch between the ideals and reality. Instead of questioning their models, right? And questioning the structure of society, they questioned human beings. They said, look, we got our understanding of human beings wrong. The liberal Enlightenment subject is a myth, and so on. We're doing that again. Now it's just where it says the reason why we have social problems is because of our inability to manage our own psychology, our own behaviors. Our misguided quest for happiness leads us to take loans we can't afford, and that causes crisis. If you want to ask people, like, what causes an economic crisis, what do they say? Greed, right? Like, everything is located within the human mind, right? And that human mind becomes not the solution again, but the problem. When we get to that point, it's dangerous, because we need the human mind to understand the world.
Yeah, it's like a new version of sin. It's almost like the reason why you're poor is because because of human sin. So that's why God created poverty. You have to earn your living by the sweat of your brow. And now the new place of sin is stress and this mindfulness and so on. Sounds like just a secular form of the new thing. Let me go to
and it is explicitly that, yeah. Oh, there's a very, very good question here, a very good point here that someone makes. Perry Michalakos, I'm not sure how to say that correctly. Signomi anto lathos. Due to increased automation, labor is less and less needed by capital for production. In turn, this dilutes the power of the general strike, the labor movement, workers' rights generally. I think that's extremely important, and I'm worried about that with a lot of people on the left. Embracing UBI. I don't know what I think about UBI at this moment, but one thing that does worry me is people say, oh, it creates a strike fund. Yeah, maybe, but it also potentially creates a humongous class of people that are entirely dependent and that cannot remove their labor at will and hold anybody to account. In fact, they're in their situation of very severe dependency. And also, like, I was talking to somebody about this, and they're like, oh, and I was like, well, with coronavirus, they're like, oh, we'll just have, we consume too much anyway, right? Too much junk gets produced anyway. And I was like, so you want to create a world in which we're all dependent on those in power, and we're told what we can and cannot consume with the money that we're given. Does that sound familiar at all to you? It sounds like feudalism. You know, and we're actually demanding that. And so I think there's a facet to that I can see how UBI potentially provide that pathway, at least it seems to provide that pathway to that future of automation that is for human beings. But I can also see it as a pathway where capitalists manage to extricate themselves from workers holding them ransom.
Well, I think with respect to Perry's question, I think one thing is very clear, that as we develop towards greater automation, the degree of constant capital to variable capital will continue to decrease, which means that the rate of profit will continue to decline. If you actually get to all the way to full automation, you actually can't earn any profit whatsoever. It's not possible to have a fully automated economy, to not employ labor and to earn a profit. So that really is the limit of capital. These are sort of terms.
Yeah, but long before we ever get there, something horrible will happen.
Absolutely right. It's already, horrible things already happening. I really want to do quickly, give a shout out to everybody who's written in, and I don't want them to feel ignored. So if you just bear with me,
I just keep cutting you off. I'm like, I'll answer these questions. Sorry.
If you just bear with me, I want to try and quickly read everybody's comments so that everybody feels that they're acknowledged here. So is there any role to mysticism? Somebody, I asked, Asli says Ramadan Kareem, that's, Ramadan, where we fast, etc. Sadia says the reason for unhappiness can also be radicalism. Thanks to the Frankfurt School for talking about subjectivity and individual psychology. Of course, we are not products which could be put in preferable or unpreferable categories. Al-Jannat Malkos from Kasur says she is translating Buddha and mysticism. Sadia says, interesting debate. They are connecting political economy and cultural materialism. That's quite right, Sadia. In fact, we're critiquing culture, what do you call it? Cultural criticism via political economy. Sadia says, I absolutely agree. Not sure what she said that too, but glad to know that. We have to enjoy it because we don't have anything else left, Adnan Real says. It's quite right. Rusht Roswa, I'm sorry if I got your name right, says, totally, why would he say not my field? Laugh out loud. Spandan Pratyush gives a smiley face, and Subhan Hussain says, this sounds pretty familiar to the book Capitalist Realism and the stuff Zizek does. Thank you. Anurag Bro Lakra says capitalism is very weird sometimes. And sometimes, bro, Rush says, meaning it's pretty weird all the time. She did talk about capitalist realism being promoted by micropolitics-based cultural critique on the lines of Mark Fisher. So maybe you want to comment on that. Postmodernism.
Yeah, I'm on the editorial board for Zero Books, so obviously Mark Fisher is close to my heart. And I did a debate with him some years ago. Yeah, obviously I'm influenced by him and Zizek, massive fan of Zizek. As much as he's not a proper Marxist, I love his cultural analysis.
Very nice. I have to make a point of reading more of him. Sadia says postmodernism is a cultural justification of capitalism and consumerism. So economy and culture are connected. Then Anurag Bro Lakra says Shant Ho J Rousseau, which means long live Rousseau. We are suffering from postmodernism, says Ulsiar. Our liberal left in Pakistan is pathetic, says Sadia Nazir. I think Dr. Frawley would agree with you. You saw her, sort of raise her hand.
Okay, don't get me wrong. Like there's a lot of good stuff in postmodernism. I do use a lot of postmodern ideas myself. I just always try to be materialist, and I by the sense of questioning truth and so on. Yeah, I do question scientific truth because I see them as part of a capitalist order.
Right. Anurag says liberal left everywhere is so pathetic. No, everywhere actually. And then agrees. Rao Muhammad Abdullah also seems to agree. And Anurag again, it's the same everywhere, says Shadman. Aware says great. Spandan says it's probably the worst realized in US when the new left kept debating political correctness through the 2008 economic crisis. Wow, that's a very good point. I didn't realize that they actually did that. Thank you for that. Anurag says happiness is a privilege. Shout to postmodernists at the back. And Sadia Nazir says the biggest cause of unhappiness is marketizing everything and evaluating it in material terms. Money is God, and capitalists think they can buy everything, but happiness is not a Louis Vuitton bag.
I don't know about that. Give me the opportunity to tell you money doesn't buy happiness. I'll be the judge.
Okay. Muhammad Walid Arif says, okay, labor class in China, for example, is being lulled by such therapy sessions and courses, and it's a move to stifle revolution. But in the West, most of the growing rich class is disillusioned, depression and anxiety is augmenting. What to do to fight anxiety, depression, and disenchantment after achieving all the material needs? I'll give you the answer: get rid of capitalism. In economic terms,
I don't actually like that argument. I don't like that argument at all.
Okay.
Because if the main problem with capitalism is that it makes us depressed, well, give everybody drugs. Like, you don't need to overthrow an entire system. Like, think about it. How do you know that what we replace it with won't be equally distressing to the psyche? What about the process of getting to that situation? You don't think that's going to be upsetting? Like, you know, I think the solution is far disproportionate to the problem, if that's the main issue. And I also think the vast majority of people are actually fine. Second, you have to understand that, here's my little controversial bit, but these categories have become very, very powerful over the last 50, 60 years. And I think, yes, there's a certain aspect of mental illness that is certainly biological, but there is a certain amount of culture going on there in that we are labeling and medicalizing sentiments that just exist in the population that don't necessarily need to be labeled and medicalized in this way. You have to be careful, because how you define a problem invites a particular solution. If the problem with capitalism is psychological, the solution is psychological. If the problem is economic, the solution is economic. You have to be careful about going down this path that basically constructs human subjectivity as problematic and weak, because we need strong subjectivity. We have to understand that human nature is incredibly open. It is incredibly variable. We do not necessarily become sick as a result of our circumstances. There's a certain amount of interpretation that is involved in that situation. If you interpret your situation as sickening, then it may become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you interpret your anger as revolutionary anger, then the solution is freedom. Like, the solution is organize. Right? And we must keep an open understanding of what it means to be human, because it is on the basis of open subjectivity that we fight the argument that says the way things are today are a reflection of human nature. Because it says the way things are today is just that's human nature. Why do we have inequality? Human nature. Some people are weak. And then it gets translated into kind terms. Some people struggle. Some people just aren't able to do it, and that's okay, you know? No, like, you have to have an understanding. For the vast majority of human beings, what we become is, we're not like a tree that is contained within the seed, right? The seed that is only ever going to sprout whatever it's supposed to sprout, a tree, a flower, whatever. A human being has the potential for infinitely extensible improvement. What a human being is today is fundamentally different than was the case in the 11th century, the 2nd century, classical Greece. And we're all the same. Biologically, we're all the same, and yet we're fundamentally so different inside. And we need to hold on to that. And I think a lot of this psychological critique of capitalism posits a very diminished and determined subject. The way that human beings are is foreclosed at the outset, that this is the way. If bad things happen, people will get sick. Not necessarily. Like, look all around the world. After there's a crisis or a disaster, not everybody gets PTSD, and we can't answer that solely biologically. There's a whole literature about culture-bound syndromes and so on. So you have to understand that it is not so straightforward how human beings react to their circumstances. And the only way that we can create, not the only way, one key facet of our ongoing project must always be the fight against those ideas that say it's just human nature, and all of those ideas that are like planted in the ground of human nature, and that you will only ever grow to be a certain thing. And if that's the case, well, then it's just this forever. But obviously it's not just this forever, because human beings have organized things differently in the past. They will organize things differently. And you can find happiness in extraordinary, awful circumstances. Like a lot of slaves were happy. That was one of the justifications for slave ownership. I'm good to my slaves, right? Or like for feudalism, kings should be good kings. Peasants should be, they should keep care of their peasants and so on. And I'm sure, like, if we had feudalism now, we had slavery now, people would be like, look, all right, you want to change the world, but look, a lot of slaves are happy, but also a lot of them are depressed. Shouldn't we go in and give them a 10-step solution so they too can find happiness? You and you're trying to change the world. When's that going to happen? Because when you were in that situation, it seemed very difficult to find your way out. But I think that we need to have criticisms of capitalism that are deeper than human subjectivity, because when we define the problem as subjective, the solution is subjective. When we define the problem as economic, the solution is economic.
I gotta tell you, that was just brilliant. In those 10 minutes were really fantastic.
Sorry, it's a little rant there. It's a hard thing to explain because it sounds so good.
No, in those 10 minutes, I think, you've overthrown everything from Eric Fromm to all the way to, Jordan Peterson. and it was very important. And actually, I agree with you. I've never been convinced of this, psychological Fromm sort of argument about, capitalism causing mass depression, etc. But, and when I read your article, I didn't, at first, I mean, I have to confess that till you spoke about it just now, I didn't get what you meant when you said that if the problem is depression, then overthrowing capitalism is overkill. But now I get it. I get exactly what you're saying, which is that if the problem is psychological, the answer would also be psychological. But if the problem is defined as being objective and structural and based in property relations and in political economy,
it also means that human beings are capable not only of understanding the world, but also through the strength of will and reason, changing the world and withstanding the consequences of that change. Very,
very true. You just thrown out, happiness completely from the framework of, examining class relations altogether. And I think that's the right way to go about it. I mean, I never thought about it that way because I never really thought about it very carefully anyway. But now that I come at it from a purely, political economy sort of side. So whatever was said in psychology, I was like, that's for other people to figure out. But, I'll go with whatever everybody's saying. But now that I think about it, I think, what you're saying makes absolute sense to me entirely. Thank you for that. That was really wonderful. Let me go through some of the other comments. In economic terms, the increase in wages not amounting to increase in happiness does represent that the inflation and wealth inequality in a profit-based society has been higher than the increase in wages. Kamal says point. Sadia says branded happiness and standardized by consumer markets we have. Class have been watered down by the new left. That's why. I asked somebody else's name. On the Geek says ignorance breeds expression with growth. Sorry?
Just about like happiness and consumerism. Another issue with the consumerism argument is that it becomes a reason, it becomes an endpoint. Like, oh, it's consumerism that does X. And we never ask, well, why consumerism? Like, why is there a necessity to create like markets for things when like half the world is starving? you know. So it never asks why. It never goes further than that. It's just like, oh, it's like fake happiness. Well, I'll take fake happiness then. You know, I mean, over like
you're like the anti-happiness philosopher in a certain sense. You're saying we're not trying to overthrow capitalism because we want people to be happy. People are already happy. We want to overthrow capitalism because some people are being exploited by other people. Have I got you right?
Absolutely, because it will increase human freedom. And like, it's pointless to say it will make people happy because happiness is a material phenomenon. Like how we find happiness is going to change depending on the material base of society. So you change that base of society and who knows what will be a requirement for human happiness 100, 200 years into the future.
It will continue to change.
Yeah, what was required to make people happy 1,000 years ago was like, what, a goat? Like for me, like a good husband, I
mean, if we were able to achieve, if it was in human nature that we would achieve perfect happiness, then I suppose we'd stop growing as well, because it's a lot of times it's unhappiness that makes me, want to sort of, it's unhappiness with myself when I write a piece of music and I'm like, oh, that's shit, Then I'm unhappy with myself. I'm unhappy with certain actions that I commit, and then I try and change myself. So sort of unhappiness is not necessarily always a negative thing.
And knowing that things could be better. And like there's a quote from Wage, Labor, and Capital that people always misquote, and I think is worth always reminding people, where Marx says, a house may be large or small, but as long as the surrounding houses are likewise small, it satisfies all requirements for a residence. But let there arise next to the house a castle, and little house shrinks to a hut. People say, see, it is wrong to want more. Can you honestly imagine Karl Marx saying, don't envy what the ruling class has? Absolutely not. He's saying that our needs are relative to the time period, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And also that castle is an important impetus to revolution, because you're like, yes. He says, it represents what human beings are capable at that time, what we're capable of. Not only that, but you probably built the damn castle. Go and take it. It's yours. That world of wealth and culture is an important precursor to revolution. You can't just say, oh, it's so sad that poor people want to have riches. If only they knew that it wouldn't bring them happiness. And then they keep getting frustrated when those poor people get on rickety boats and try to get into the EU. And they're trying to tell them, no, stay there. No amount of telling people to stay back is going to make them stay back, because they know that the world is theirs to take and they want it. And they should want it. It belongs to all human beings. And that world of wealth, that's the dissatisfaction because you know things could be better. And people are trying to tell you, no, don't want more. Be happy with the way things are. And people are like, no, because I know I built a damn mansion today. I want to live in a mansion. You know, I want to have not just decent housing, I want to have really good housing for everybody. And we can do that. It is possible. If that was the goal, if we were not alienated from our ends, we could do that. We could provide a better life for everybody. And I bet you people would enjoy doing it if you did it, if that was the purpose of your life and that's what you wanted to do, to make things better, to create a better machine, people would do it.
You know, interestingly, in Pakistan, most houses are built with bricks rather than with concrete, etc. And the people who make those bricks are mostly indentured and bonded laborers. They work in horrible sort of circumstances. And to think, and you know, and the houses they live, the huts, I can't call them houses, the huts they live in, which are right next to the kiln itself, are made from the bricks that are rejects and don't get sold on the market. So they bring them, they build them. And the most interesting thing is that the bricks with which they build them, they don't have any cement in the middle, right? So that means the heat, the heat and cold gets in and out very easily, because they're just basically bricks piled on top of each other without anything insulating them. And that's how most people who build bricks live. Now you tell them that they shouldn't want a house, they should be happy to live in that particular circumstance. That sounds insane. It sounds absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, but you see how there's a basis of that sort of liberal humanist project that needs to be carried forward there, because you have a right to feel bad about that, because you're made of the same stuff as the person who lives in that house.
Absolutely, you made that house.
Thing. And you built the house. But it's that human equality, right? Because we're all made of the same stuff. Why is it okay that the people who work the hardest as well should be happy with less? And the craziest thing is, why is that progressive? How, in what universe did it become progressive to say, you shouldn't want to have that lovely house made with the bricks, you know, the properly made house. No, you shouldn't want that. That's bad. Oh, consumerism. Ugh.
Is there any hope, Ashley, from the left, from the woke left in the West? Can we be hopeful that they will, you know, change course, that they will look at these material phenomena, look at political economy, stop chasing this wild goose chase of, you know, trying to make everybody happy and so on and so forth?
I don't think they're trying to make everybody happy. I think what those people are,
everybody miserable, including themselves.
What the like positive psychologists and that sort of thing are doing is they're not necessarily trying to make people happy. They think they've set happiness up as something difficult, and so they just want to give people just like a functioning, because they think that doesn't naturally exist within people. So it's not that they want to like create a happy world or something like that. They might say that, but a lot of them would just be like, no, I'm just trying to like get you through the day, because without me,
you deal with your problem.
That's the subtext.
No, I get it. Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. But be that as it may, my question still stands. Is it possible to move? Yeah, there's millions of young people now on the left, or at least who identify with the left, right? But they identify with the kind of left that I really can't identify with that left at all. Because, you know, the sort of issues that they chase, the sort of things that they chase, and the way that they chase those things, they seem to be completely disconnected from the working class and from working class struggles. Is there hope yet that they can be brought back to this analysis of, you know, well, let's look at, you know, let's get back to the working class, let's get back to healthcare, education, you know, better housing,
yeah, but not
better
through the
living
state.
conditions.
Like, okay, I think this is where you and I differ, because a lot of those people, they are totally on board with everything you just said. Let's get back to,
Okay.
but they want the state to provide that. And they get angry when working class people don't vote for the political parties that they think are providing that. And they go, why do you keep voting against your own interests? And the answer is because they don't want to live as wards of the state. They want, like, yeah, absolutely, you need that. You need all that stuff as a safety net. But as the end goal of everything that we're doing, it is totally misguided. It should be like, yeah, of course we have those things, because if you don't work in capitalism, you're screwed, right? So we have to have that background there in case you get tossed out. And we should be fighting for workers' power. We should move away from seeing workers as victims, as people who are like, charitable, they're with one vote, you can stop a child from sleeping on an NHS floor. Like, it's not a charity drive. It's about power. Like, people in power should fear the working class. You shouldn't see them as wards or victims. And I think that is what a lot of people are rejecting. A lot of working people are rejecting people who look down on them, see them as so many social problems. And then when they say, look, I want some control over my life, I want job security, they're like, oh, that's right wing. How's that right wing? Like, why do you go on strike? You go on strike because you want more. You want security and the freedom within capitalism that comes with that security. Nobody wants to be thrown about. Like, yes, it's a good thing when you have that safety net, but it's not like you're like, oh boy, that's so great. That's all I want in the world. No, you want that to be there for the time when capitalism spits you out, but you want to find a way for capitalism. You want to fight to not be spat out at the end of it. That's what working people have been fighting for a long time. That's what the miners' strike was about. That don't you dare spit me out. When the economy changes, I'm not going to pay. I'm not going to pay for that. And that's what people are fighting about. And so we've totally given up on that. And it's because the left is about welfare, welfare, welfare. That is the worst case scenario. That's nobody's aspiration.
So what you're saying is basically that because social democracy gives this narrative that this is charity that we're doing for you. That's what working people are rejecting. They're rejecting the patronizing attitude.
They don't even realize that they're talking about this charitably. It's just something I noticed the last election in the UK, the last few days, the desperation of people like taking pictures of a child sleeping on an NHS floor. And I was like, oh, no, this is not going anywhere good. Guys, stop doing that. And of course, when they lost, instead of looking at ourselves and saying, why did our ideas fail to inspire people? They got angry at the working class. And they, stupid people, they're duped by capitalism. They're duped by, people on Facebook and fake news and so on. And until we have a serious, sober reckoning with why that narrative is not appealing, we will keep seeing upsets.
Amazing. And do you think Corbyn was guilty of some of that narrative? Was he?
I don't know about Corbyn himself, but he was between a rock and a hard place because he had elements of his party that were like, he was trying to keep the whole thing together. And I know, like, him being a Eurosceptic and so on, had to capitulate on that. And basically, there was just so many internal problems within that party that got spat out in a totally coherent message that obviously just failed to inspire people. But I found it I found that pretty obvious. And I was like, yeah, well, you guys got to sort that out. But amazing how afterward, nobody was talking about that. They were just so angry at the media. Like, okay, it's a capitalist media. What are you going to expect? Of course, they're not going to be like, oh, socialism, that sounds great.
No, you have to also respect. You're absolutely right. Listen, I want to take one very important question. Shadab Murtaza was a comrade of mine. He says, happiness is a social being. How can I, as an individual, be happy? I think what he means is that happiness is something that we get from society or is developed out of social living. How can I, as an individual, be happy when I see a great number of people around me living in miserable conditions of life? In such a situation, my individual happiness can arise only as an apathy to the social misery around me. What is the role of alienation generated by capitalism in dematerialization of the left? So you want to take a dig at that?
I need to see it written down. What time was that?
Sure. It's sort of 6:23 p.m. You'll have to scroll nearly all the way down.
Okay. How can I, as an individual, in such a situation? Okay. There's lots of questions kind of in there. Yeah, I think focusing on your own individual happiness is always going to make you miserable. no matter what world you're in, because you just can't be happy all the time. And a life that is spent focused on yourself and your own internal world is a pointless life. Human beings have always needed an anchor for meaning and truth that's beyond the self. We had it in religion, and that's gone. We had it in tradition, that's gone. And for politics, that anchor was always in the future, some future world that was better. And now we've lost that. And so where's the anchor for truth? The self, feelings. And it's always going to be unsatisfactory, because if that's your whole purpose in life, your feelings, then any kind of attack on well-being is going to be an attack on your entire purpose in life. It's going to be, fundamental. And I remember, like, I grew up in therapy culture. Like, I grew up in this world where I thought it was like scientifically proven that you should be thinking about your feelings all the time. And I was like, oh, why can't I just be happy? And I would like post like, affirmations on my wall that I should read all the time. This is to get an idea what I was like as an undergraduate. It's embarrassing. And I was like, don't save your happiness up for the future. Be happy now. And I was like, oh, why can't I just be happy? And I was so miserable because my life had no purpose. Right. And then I read, I got a hold of Frank Furedi's book, Therapy Culture. And for me, it was life changing. And then I read Foucault and so on. And just to realize that these things were discourses that had a history and that fit into basically, it's oversimplified, but it's basically like regimes of social control. I was incensed. I was pissed off. I was like, you told me that as a good citizen, that's how I should be. I should be thinking about my own feelings all the time. And if I'm not happy, I should seek professional help. And it's amazing how liberating it was when I realized you don't need to do that. Just forget about it. No, I don't think about my own feelings at all because I am immersed. Oh, not at all. Very, very little. If I do, it means I've been alone for too long or something. I don't know. But because I'm immersed in projects beyond myself, bigger than myself, in which I find meaning and significance. And like writing a book, for example, do not recommend it if you're searching for happiness. It sucks. It's very difficult, but you don't do these things. You don't pursue these meaningful projects because they'll make you happy. You do it because it makes suffering worthwhile. It makes suffering bearable. Paradoxically, if happiness is your destination, no suffering is bearable. Any adversity is completely unbearable because you have no purpose. You have nothing to suffer for.
Fascinating. Taimur Iqbal asked a very good question.
Very, very Jordan Peterson. It's the only thing that I overlap with Jordan Peterson on because I very much like Viktor Frankl. I do but I take it into this sort of materialist kind of communist project where it's like this future freedom of humanity that drives me, and that's what makes suffering worthwhile. I think you've got to give us a reading list. You've got to, because I think most people will forget the references you're making, etc. But you've got to give us at least 2-3 books to read to start off with to understand why we should not be chasing happiness. Oscar Wilde's Old Man Under Socialism is a very short essay. It's fantastic.
I got that one, but this other one that you were referencing, Frank something or the other.
Viktor Frankl and then Frank Furedi's Therapy Culture.
Therapy Culture, yeah. So please just, if you could just write those down and send them, and I'll share them with all the comrades. Taimur Iqbal asks, but how do we bring back the class consciousness to the working? How do we make the working class conscious again? Dr. Ashley, what's your take, please?
Oh boy, I don't know. I think that we have to bring back an aspirational leftist movement, something that is materialist, something that is able to speak to people's desire for a better life, and that is real and says, you can have it. I'm not here to tell you you have to be anything else. Like, if you can think about like Che Guevara going out to the countryside, do you think that he was like, yeah, you see, peasants, you've got some bad ideas in your head, you're a bit racist. No, like, when I was doing my research on the student newspapers, there was a very good line that a student wrote in 1933, I think, where he said, take care of the bread and culture will take care of itself. Wow. And it's a very good line just to be buried in a student newspaper from a million years ago. But I always keep that in mind because that is really what drove past socialist and communist movements. They weren't trying to reform people's subjectivity necessarily. I mean, there's a certain amount of like vanguardism that does that. But like to the extent today where it's like we're holding off the revolution to the day when the workers are good enough. And it's just so patronizing. It's just so patronizing. We need a movement that is materialist, that says, I'm going to make this world of wealth and culture that we are creating, it is yours. You deserve it. You deserve it. We're going to fight for it. Now that's dangerous. And there were a few movements in the 20th century that were like that. And you can darn well be sure that those in power were not like, oh, good ideas, capitulating like they are now. Like everybody's falling all over themselves to be more woke. What did they do to like the Black Panthers? They freaking shot them in their sleep. And they had a very universalist, humanist kind of understanding of things, in spite of the fact that they were like obviously working toward particularities within that. But they were like not all about, oh, white people versus Black people and so on. They had a very materialist, very sort of progressive kind of idea. These kinds of ideas, when they're properly dangerous, you know it. You know it because the state moves to clamp down on them. Like if you want to have a sense of whether or not what you're doing is powerful, look at how those in power, look at how institutions respond. Are they falling all over themselves to like, listen, go on, tell me more? Or are they trying to shut you down? You know, that, and I think, you know, that kind of movement that says, you know, the world is yours and you deserve it, that's dangerous. And that'll be shut down. And that will be a fight.
If workers are being organized to take, you know, the wealth and power and properties of capitalists away from them, that's going to be quite problematic for the ruling class.
You know, somebody asked before, like, communism degenerated into terrible things in the past. How do you want to get beyond that? I actually think that that is a very important point. And I think, like, you don't just organize people willy-nilly to, like you're risking people's lives for a project that may not work. So you got to be sure. I think that we need a lot of debate as well. And we need to have a sense of, we have to have a very good understanding and analysis of the world, because what you're really saying is massive. Like communism's not a lifestyle. You're talking about overthrowing the entire existing order of things. You got to be darn well sure you're right. And I'm open to being, I hope I am wrong. I hope that capitalism can be reformed. I think that'd be great. We should certainly fight for reforms to the extent that they're but I don't think, I think that the problem, you know, the labor theory of value, I think is correct. And it tells us that this system is taking us to terrible places. But we just have to be sure that we're right about that. We have to be sure that we have a plan and a strategy that is worth fighting for as well. And I think that's the hard thing today, because we do need to really rationally understand what happened in the 20th century so that we never repeat it. I mean, it's terrifying. I legitimately am terrified by that. I would never say, let's like pick up arms tomorrow. That's crazy. We don't know what we're fighting for right now. We don't
I'm very happy.
Things without the market. We have never been able, as human beings, to answer that question.
Yeah, I'm very happy that there's also a comment from Dhaka, from Levin Ahmed, who says, solidarity with Taimur and Ashley from Dhaka. Thank you very much. And I think Sadia Nazir is really in your corner. She says, fight, which is quite nice. All right, I think we're gonna call this to a close. Thank you so much, Dr. Frawley. Some very unorthodox views, even for me. I mean, I consider myself, even for me. I mean, I consider myself an orthodox Marxist, Leninist, communist, whatever, you know, category you want to put me in. And yet, on the question of happiness, I wasn't really as clear as you've been. I'm definitely going to read your book, and I'm going to recommend it to other people to read as well. You know, and what I take from what you're saying is that we've got to look at the objective conditions. We've got to do a materialist analysis, and we've got to find out how our labor, the labor of working people, is being taken away from us, and how that's restricting the opportunities that are available to us, and how we've got to take that back. That's how I take it. And I think, you know, and I take your point completely, that this whole idea of chasing happiness, or not even chasing happiness, but getting by in life, etc., etc. You know, we just got to get out of that entire framework altogether and start having goals that make more sense than goals that are, well, as you put it, well, human beings can be are not machines. And we operate in many complex different ways, and it's pretty difficult to work that out. And anybody's trying to do that is probably making a mess of it anyway. So let's just get out of that whole business and focus on what's important, which is to get bread to people, fight poverty, just eliminate poverty in the world, you know, give people a better chance to make whatever it is that they want to make of their life. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I think you've been able to see that we've been able to raise quite a bit of interest, despite the fact that there is a language barrier between, the language we're communicating it, and most of the people who follow me on Facebook, but despite that, I think a lot of people have tuned in to listen, and a lot of people from India, as you've seen, from Bangladesh, and from many other parts of the world. And so hopefully we can continue these conversations and bring more people into this conversation, and build a better world. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.